welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
I want you to start by just imagining a society that voluntarily amputates its own eyes.
Right.
Just because looking at reality is deemed simply too offensive.
It's a brutal image.
Seriously, picture that mental landscape for a second. A culture that actively and deliberately blinds itself to the physical laws of the universe because the unvarnished truth hurts its feelings.
Yeah, that is the extremely provocative and highly visceral premise that kicks off our whole exploration today.
Which is quite the hook.
It is a striking foundational image, and it perfectly sets the stage for the architecture of the argument we're going to unpack. It signals right away that we're dealing with a text that views the modern world not as a system in progress.
Or even just in a mild decline.
Right, exactly. Not a mild decline, but a framework that is fundamentally broken and actively operating in a state of mass denial regarding biological and physical reality.
But before we start dissecting this architecture, I want to remind you to like and subscribe to the deep dive.
Yes, please do.
We thrive on your support to keep bringing you these extensive breakdowns. And I strongly encourage you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy today's featured ebook.
It's called Walking on Water, Clear Ordered Thinking by Conrad Riker, published in 2025.
And you will also definitely want to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Yeah, we need to lay out the mission and the parameters for this specific deep dive clearly up front.
Definitely.
Because we are examining a text that is explicitly written for men's rights activists and men operating within the quote-unquote red-pilled manosphere.
Right.
Its core mission is to construct a comprehensive history of Western institutions and detail exactly how, according to the framework presented, those institutions were captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Which brings us to a mandatory neutrality disclaimer.
Very important today.
We need to explicitly state the ground rules for the next hour or so. The source material contains highly politically charged content regarding gender dynamics, left-wing and right-wing politics, and the fundamental structures of our society.
So we want to emphasize to you listening right now that we are not endorsing or taking sides on any of the viewpoints presented in this book.
Not at all. Our mission today is purely analytical. We're acting as your expert guides to impartially report on the contents of the book.
Right, just helping you understand the exact arguments, the underlying philosophy, and the specific worldview the author is constructing for his target audience.
We're essentially looking at the blueprint of a very specific, highly systematized ideology, examining how the structural supports are put together.
And the very first load-bearing pillar the text establishes is a philosophical one.
Okay.
It posits that there has been a complete death of objective truth in the public square.
A total death.
Yeah, the argument presented is that modern society has traded the granite blocks of Aristotelian logic for the wet cardboard of postmodern relativism.
The rhetorical impact of that visual, granite versus wet cardboard, is pretty significant.
It does a lot of heavy lifting.
Literally. The author is framing classical logic as structural and capable of bearing weight. In an Aristotelian system, A is A, and A cannot be non-A.
Right, the principle of non-contradiction.
Exactly. You can build a civilization, a legal code, and an engineering paradigm on that rigidity.
Because it doesn't move.
Right. By contrast, postmodern relativism is categorized as the wet cardboard.
Which collapses under any pressure.
Right. This is the philosophical idea that truth is subjective, that reality is merely a collection of competing narratives, and that personal lived experience or emotional resonance dictates the reality of a given situation.
The author asserts that you cannot build a functional skyscraper, let alone a multi-generational civilization on wet cardboard.
It inevitably collapses.
Right, and this philosophical baseline directly informs one of the most aggressive and recurring metaphors used throughout the text.
Which is?
The conceptualization of the NPC.
Ah, right, the non-player character.
The text assumes the reader is highly familiar with internet culture utilizing this trope.
Because in gaming, an NPC is a background entity that operates purely on pre-programmed dialogue trees.
Exactly. They just walk around the digital town saying the same 3 lines.
So the author takes this digital concept and maps it directly onto what he categorizes as the female-coded left.
It's a deliberate dehumanization tactic designed to categorize political opponents not as thinking individuals with different viewpoints,
but as a literal hive mind.
Yeah. The text describes these individuals essentially as cognitive zombies lacking an internal monologue.
Wow.
The argument is that when you engage in a debate with these individuals, You're not actually interfacing with a sovereign consciousness.
You're just triggering a playback mechanism.
You're hearing pre-programmed scripts that have been downloaded directly from the mainstream media and what the author terms university indoctrination mills.
I think the phrasing used is that they are empty vessels filled by the cultural sewage of the mainstream media.
Very intense language.
But if we look at the strategic utility of this framing for the target audience, it operates as a psychological shield.
How so?
If a man reading this feels alienated or constantly attacked by mainstream societal norms, this framework tells him that he's not crazy.
Oh, I see.
Right? Rather, he is surrounded by an artificial intelligence that is incapable of logical processing.
So the proposed solution to this environment, then, is a complete rejection of modern consensus and a return to classical antiquity.
The text heavily emphasizes reclaiming the intellectual giants, starting with Plato,
Specifically, it points to Plato's theory of forms.
which is the philosophical concept that non-physical immutable ideas or forms represent the highest and most accurate reality.
By anchoring his argument in Plato, the author is establishing that truth exists completely independently of human emotion.
Or societal consensus.
Right. Or the desire for reality to be accommodating. The truth is a hard object in the room.
If it causes discomfort, the failure lies with the individual's emotional fragility, not the truth itself.
And to navigate that hard reality, the text pairs Plato's forms with Aristotle's syllogisms.
The author describes the syllogism as a blade to slice through the Gordian knot of media narratives.
Because if we think about how a syllogism works, if premise A is demonstrably true and premise B is demonstrably true,
Then conclusion C is a mathematical inevitability.
exactly. The author is instructing his readers to utilize cold, step-by-step deductive reasoning as a defensive weapon.
You don't let emotional appeals interrupt the sequence between premise A and conclusion C.
This classical inheritance is framed not just as an intellectual exercise, but as the very engine of historical progress.
The text groups this logic with Roman civic duty and Stoic pragmatism.
The cultural technologies that the author claims built empires out of mudblood and engineering.
This is then starkly contrasted with the modern era, which the text categorizes as a culture of victimhood.
Where the highest attainable societal status is achieved by claiming to be the most oppressed entity in the room.
Which leads us into the text's analysis of how this cultural inversion was achieved in the first place.
Right. The author points to decades-long media subversion, which he formally titles the narrative of nullity.
He leverages historical data regarding the media portrayal of fathers to track this decline.
He points to the television landscape of the 1950s and 60s, citing cultural touchstones like Father Knows Best and The Andy Griffith Show.
And the data he cites suggests that during that era, upward of 70% of fathers were depicted as competent, emotionally stable authority figures who guided the moral center of the household.
The contrast presented is the post-1990s media landscape, where the author claims that statistical reality has been entirely inverted.
Because the modern media archetype of the father, think of the endless parade of sitcom dads.
The Homer Simpsons, the Peter Griffins.
Exactly, is almost exclusively portrayed as a buffoon. He's an overgrown adolescent, physically inept, emotionally stunted, and constantly requiring management by a significantly more competent, hyper-rational wife.
For the author, this shift is not merely a reflection of changing comedic tastes.
Or a natural evolution of the sitcom format.
Right, it is categorized as a deliberate psychological operation.
The argument is that you cannot dismantle a traditional hierarchical society without first stripping the father figure of his telos.
His ultimate philosophical purpose and inherent authority as the head of the household.
Because by normalizing the incompetence of the patriarch in fiction, you soften the ground for his removal in reality.
And the text points to the corporate world to prove that this removal is actively happening.
What's a case study there?
The ultimate case study provided for this phenomenon is James Damore, the former Google engineer.
Oh, right.
The text elevates Damore to the status of a modern martyr for objective truth.
So just to recall the specifics of that case for you listening, Damore authored an internal corporate memo that cited peer-reviewed evolutionary psychology.
He utilized data regarding biological sex differences to hypothesize why there might be statistical disparities in certain high-stress engineering roles,
suggesting that it might not be entirely the result of systemic structural sexism, but partly due to differing biological predilections for interacting with systems versus people.
And the corporate response to that memo was immediate termination.
The author frames this firing as definitive proof of the existence of a gynocentric priesthood.
The terminology there is vital. By calling it a priesthood, the text is arguing that modern corporate HR departments do not operate on logic or profit maximization.
But on religious dogma.
Right, when Damore cited biological facts that contradicted the religious doctrine of equal outcome, he wasn't fired for being incorrect. He was excommunicated for heresy.
It's framed as the modern equivalent of Galileo facing the Inquisition for suggesting the Earth revolves around the sun.
The institution didn't care about Galileo's telescope, they cared about maintaining the structural integrity of their narrative.
And this specific case study acts as the primary bridge in the book from abstract philosophy into hard, quantifiable biology.
The logic follows that if the dominant culture is actively punishing the citation of scientific data, then that specific scientific data contains the exact reality the culture is trying to suppress.
Which brings us to the core biological arguments of the text.
Specifically, the concept of the biological imperative and what the author heavily emphasizes as the burden of performance.
The text leans intensely on evolutionary psychology to construct a rigid determinist view of human behavior.
The foundational pillar of this biological argument begins in 1948 with A.J. Bateman's data on fruit flies.
Bateman's principle is a cornerstone of evolutionary biology.
Right. By observing fruit flies, Bateman noted that the variance in reproductive success is vastly greater in males than in females.
Meaning nearly all females will reproduce to some degree, but a small percentage of males will monopolize the reproductive opportunities,
leaving a massive percentage of males entirely shut out of the genetic future.
The author extrapolates Bateman's principle to introduce the greater male variability hypothesis in humans.
This is the statistical observation that males exhibit a wider bell curve of traits across almost every metric.
The text points out that because of this wider distribution, you find more males at the absolute extremes of society.
Right, you have more male geniuses, inventors, and hyper-successful CEOs.
But simultaneously, you have vastly more male criminals, homeless individuals, and societal dropouts.
The author uses this statistical reality to mount a direct attack on modern egalitarianism.
Because if the male biological distribution inherently produces a wider variance of extremes, then the political demand for equality of outcome across all corporate and social metrics is mathematically impossible.
You cannot mandate equal representation at the apex of a hierarchy if the biological raw material is distributed unevenly.
Therefore, the text argues the male sex is inherently hardwired to be competitive and hierarchical.
Men are biologically designed to seek status, protect, and take immense physical and social risks.
Because failing to do so historically meant being wiped from the genetic pool entirely.
The text insists that these are not toxic traits programmed by a patriarchal culture. They are the fundamental engine of human survival and civilizational advancement.
But this raises a critical structural question.
If male biology is hardwired for intense hierarchical competition, what happens to the male organism when it is placed inside a modern society that continuously pathologizes hierarchy and punishes competitive behavior?
To answer that, the author synthesizes the Pareto principle with Robert Sapolsky's neuroendocrinology research.
We all know the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, which in this context means that a very small percentage of males reap the vast majority of societal and reproductive rewards.
But the author brings in Sapolsky to explain the physical costs of failing in that hierarchy.
Sapolsky spent decades studying baboon troops in the African savanna, meticulously tracking their social structures and drawing their blood to measure hormone levels.
And his findings were groundbreaking.
He discovered that a baboon's rank in the dominance hierarchy directly and profoundly dictates its physical health.
Low-status males who were constantly subordinated and denied access to resources didn't just feel sad.
Right, they suffered from chronically elevated levels of cortisol, the primary stress hormone.
This chronic cortisol exposure actively suppressed their immune systems, elevated their blood pressure, and led to severe cardiovascular disease.
The author maps this biological reality directly onto modern human males.
The argument presented is that for a man, attaining status is not merely a vanity project or a culturally conditioned desire for a nice car.
It is a physiological necessity for survival.
When a modern man is stripped of his status, constantly told that his masculine drives are problematic, and denied the opportunity to engage in meaningful competition, his body reacts exactly like a low-status baboon.
His internal chemistry turns toxic, and his body literally begins to consume itself through stress-induced inflammation.
This physiological framework is how the text completely reframes the modern incel phenomenon.
Mainstream sociological analysis typically categorizes involuntary celibates as a toxic internet subculture born of entitlement, or as a purely social construct resulting from poor socialization.
The author outright rejects this. He views the incel through a strictly biological deterministic lens.
He argues that these young men are experiencing a catastrophic physiological response to environmental deprivation.
They have been denied the burden of performance.
They're born with the high energy, aggressive, status seeking neurochemistry that built the modern world. But the modern world offers them zero acceptable outlets for that energy.
They're told to sit still, be quiet, and suppress their nature.
The result, the author claims, is not just internet bitterness, but a very real depression epidemic.
And he categorizes this depression not as a chemical imbalance to be medicated, but as a biological check engine light.
It is the organism screaming that its fundamental evolutionary needs are being denied.
So the proposed solution to this biological crisis is not therapy, but a brutal reclamation of physiology.
However, the text draws a very sharp distinction regarding how this physiology should be reclaimed.
Because it levels a scathing critique against what it terms the modern gimsel.
Right, a gymsel, according to the book's taxonomy, is a man who spends hours lifting weights but does so purely for narcissism.
He is sculpting his physique for the mirror for Instagram validation.
And ultimately, to appeal to the very female-centric gaze, the author argues he should be rejecting.
The text argues that this man may have broad shoulders, but he remains mentally impotent, politically illiterate, and perfectly compliant with the system that is destroying him.
To contrast the gimsel, the author invokes the classical archetype of Hephaestus, the Greek god of the forge.
Hephaestus wasn't laboring at the anvil to achieve hypertrophy or look aesthetically pleasing in a tunic.
He hammered metal in extreme heat to forge the infrastructure of the gods. He brought physical order to chaos.
The author insists that men must reclaim their bodies for the purpose of utility and competence, not vanity.
And this begins with an escape from what he calls the chemical chaos of the modern environment.
The text argues that modern commercial diets are actively chemically compromising male biology.
It specifically targets industrial vegetable oils, microplastics in the water supply, and processed sugars, claiming these elements act as endocrine disruptors that systematically lower testosterone.
The argument is that these chemicals make men physically soft, lethargic, and ultimately politically compliant.
You simply cannot maintain the granite blocks of clear ordered thinking if your physical substrate is polluted.
To provide empirical backing for this philosophy of physical hardship, the author points to Mark Mattson's 2008 research on neurogenesis.
Mattson is a prominent neuroscientist who extensively studied the effects of fasting and caloric restriction on the brain.
His research demonstrated that when a mammalian body is placed in a state of caloric deficit, when it is genuinely hungry, the brain triggers the release of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF.
This is a critical point in the text's argument.
BDNF is a protein that actively promotes the growth of new neurons and synapses.
If we look at the evolutionary logic here, it is profound. When a hunter-gatherer was starving, his brain didn't power down.
It flooded with BDNF to maximize cognitive sharpness, focus, and problem-solving ability, so he could successfully hunt and survive.
A satiated, comfortable organism has no biological incentive to grow new neural pathways.
The author weaponizes this hard science to make a sweeping philosophical declaration. Modern comfort is the absolute enemy of a clear mind.
To achieve the intellectual resilience necessary to see through the cultural programming we discussed earlier, a man must actively subject himself to physical hardship.
Hunger, strenuous lifting, and physical exhaustion are not punishments. They are the biological prerequisites for achieving clarity.
So if the text establishes that men are being made comfortable, chemically soft, and pacified, the logical progression demands we ask who or what is architecting this pacification.
Which brings us directly to the text's deeply cynical view of the state and the legal system.
The author points the finger at the modern bureaucratic apparatus, drawing a direct and unflattering parallel to the late Roman Empire.
He invokes the classic concept of panem et circenses, bread and circuses.
This was the strategy utilized by Roman emperors to pacify a massive, potentially volatile populace.
Instead of demanding civic virtue, military service, or stoic sacrifice, the state simply provided free grain and staged massive bloody gladiatorial games.
As long as the citizens were fed and entertained, they surrendered their political agency.
The author argues that the modern welfare state operates on the exact same pacification blueprint.
He takes it a step further, arguing that the modern state has literally usurped the role of the traditional husband and father.
By constructing a vast financial safety net, housing subsidies, food assistance, single mother benefits, the state has removed the absolute necessity of the male provider.
In doing so, the text claims the state has reduced the sovereign citizen to the status of a dependent child.
The populace trades its dangerous masculine agency for a full belly and the endless distraction of a glowing screen.
To explain the moral psychology that allowed this massive expansion of the state, the author utilizes Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory.
Haidt is a highly respected social psychologist who identified that different political tribes prioritize varying foundational moral values.
According to Haidt's data, individuals on the political left heavily prioritize the care-harm foundation.
Their moral universe centers on nurturing the vulnerable, protecting the weak, and creating absolute safety.
The author uses this framework to argue that while the left is obsessed with the care-harm axis, they are entirely blind to the other critical foundations necessary for a functioning society.
Which are loyalty, authority, and sanctity.
Right. The text argues that because the modern state is captured by this hyper-maternal care-harm ideology, it inherently pathologizes male competitiveness.
The harsh, unforgiving realities of meritocracy, physical hierarchy, and risk-taking are viewed through the care-harm lens as harmful and oppressive.
The state, therefore, attempts to dismantle these structures, completely failing to realize that those very frameworks of authority and rigorous competition are what generated the complex civilization they are currently enjoying.
This theoretical critique is then applied directly to the justice system.
The author views the modern legal apparatus not as an impartial arbiter of truth, but as an institution that has been entirely captured by this care-harm ideology, often at the explicit expense of factual justice.
He points specifically to the shift in evidentiary standards within quasi-legal environments such as university Title IX tribunals.
This is a massive structural complaint in the book.
In traditional Western jurisprudence, the bedrock standard for conviction is beyond the reasonable doubt.
This requires near absolute certainty, reflecting the immense weight of state power stripping a citizen of their liberty.
However, the author details how administrative tribunals have shifted to the preponderance of evidence standard.
Under preponderance of evidence, the threshold for guilt is essentially 50.01%.
You merely have to believe it is slightly more likely than not that an event occurred.
The author argues that when you pair this mathematically fragile threshold with a cultural environment that dictates the starting premise must be believe women, a fair trial becomes a logical impossibility.
He frames it as a formal mathematical fallacy.
If the tribunal enters the room with the a priori assumption that the accuser must be believed because to question her would violate the care-harm foundation,
Then the accused man starts the trial, already past the 50.01% threshold of guilt.
the rules of forensic evidence are functionally suspended, and the tribunal becomes a formalized ritual of validating victimhood rather than a search for objective truth.
To anchor this theoretical argument in reality, the text examines two highly publicized, culturally defining case studies.
The first is the 2006 Duke lacrosse scandal.
The author doesn't just mention that the accused athletes were found innocent. He focuses specifically on the actions of the prosecutor, Mike Nafong.
The text highlights that Nafong possessed exculpatory DNA evidence.
Hard physical forensic proof that the accused men were not present and did not commit the crime.
Yet Nafong actively suppressed this evidence and pushed forward with the prosecution.
The author uses this to argue that Nifong was acting under a form of ideological possession.
The objective truth of the DNA was irrelevant compared to the political utility of the narrative.
The mob demanded the ritual punishment of privileged masculine athletes to validate their worldview, and the legal system was willing to sacrifice innocent men to appease that mob.
The second case study is the Emma Sulkovich controversy at Columbia University, commonly referred to as the mattress girl case.
The text notes that the accused male student, Paul Nungesser, was cleared of all charges by both the university's internal investigation and the actual police.
Despite this total exoneration based on evidence, Sulkovich was celebrated by the university administration and the media for carrying a mattress around campus as a performance art piece representing her alleged trauma.
The author leverages this to demonstrate that the academic and media establishments no longer value truth.
They allowed a cleared innocent man's reputation to be permanently destroyed because the emotional reality of the accuser was granted higher societal status than forensic evidence and legal due process.
For the target audience reading this, the message is chilling. These are not isolated miscarriages of justice.
They are presented as symptomatic evidence that the state legal apparatus is no longer a guarantor of individual rights, but an active predatory force targeting male potential.
Which brings us to a darkly comedic yet philosophically heavy anecdote the author uses to describe the people running this apparatus.
He introduces the concept of the bureaucratic bugman.
He shares an observational story about a mid-level, highly progressive corporate HR manager who gets a flat tire on the interstate.
This manager, a man who wields immense power over people's livelihoods and careers through spreadsheets and compliance policies, is completely paralyzed by the physical reality of a lug nut.
He lacks the physical competence and the baseline mechanical logic to change a tire.
The author uses this pathetic image of a man staring helplessly at a tire iron to illustrate a profound structural vulnerability in the West.
We have allowed the state and the corporate world to be governed by a managerial class that is entirely insulated from physical reality.
They manage human capital through abstractions, but they possess zero competence in the physical world.
The author's prescribed response to a system managed by these individuals is rooted in classical legal theory. Lex iusta non est lex, an unjust law is no law.
He is essentially instructing his readers that if a corporate policy contradicts biological nature, or if a legal framework is designed purely to elevate victimhood at the expense of merit and truth, it is intellectually illegitimate.
While a man might have to navigate these rules defensively to survive, he is under no moral obligation to respect them in his own mind.
But navigating defensively requires knowing exactly how the enemy took the castle.
And that bridges us seamlessly into the text's historical mapping of this capture.
The author doesn't just complain about the current state of affairs, he traces the lineage of this ideological shift, identifying a very specific origin point.
He points to 1923 and the founding of the Institute for Social Research at Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany.
This institution was founded by Felix Weil and is universally recognized as the birthplace of the Frankfurt School.
The text focuses on key Marxist intellectuals operating out of this institute, primarily Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and later Herbert Marcuse.
To understand the author's argument, we have to look at the historical context of the 1920s. These thinkers were analyzing a monumental failure.
Traditional economic Marxism had not worked as predicted.
Right. Karl Marx had prophesied that the working class, the proletariat in advanced industrialized nations like Germany and England would inevitably unite,
Recognize their exploitation.
and violently overthrow the capitalist bourgeoisie.
But World War I happened, and instead of uniting across borders based on class, the working men of Europe put on their national uniforms and slaughtered each other in the trenches, based on patriotism and loyalty to their respective nations.
The author argues that the Frankfurt School intellectuals realized that economic Marxism was a dead end in the West.
The working class was too deeply tethered to their cultural foundations.
So according to the text, they executed a massive strategic pivot.
If they could not conquer the West by seizing the means of economic production, they would conquer it by seizing the means of cultural production.
This is the genesis of what the text refers to as cultural Marxism.
The argument is that they developed critical theory not as an objective tool for societal analysis, but as a deliberate weapon designed to ruthlessly critique and dismantle the foundational pillars of Western civilization.
Instead of framing the world merely as the rich oppressing the poor, they expanded the matrix of oppression to identity.
They targeted the nuclear family, traditional religious structures, national patriotism, and most crucially for this book, inherent masculinity.
The text also incorporates the strategy of Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist who was imprisoned by Mussolini.
Gramsci developed a concept of cultural hegemony.
He realized that power is not just maintained through police force, but through the normalization of an ideology.
He argued that to truly change a society, a revolutionary movement must capture the organic intellectual.
The authors, the journalists, the teachers, and the filmmakers who create the cultural air that the populace breathes.
The author adopts Gramsci's framework and labels this the long march through the institutions.
The narrative presented in the book tracks these intellectuals as they fled the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s, arriving in America and embedding themselves deeply within elite academic institutions like Columbia University.
From those highly prestigious perches, the text argues their ideology acted as a slow-acting virus, replicating and spreading throughout the entirety of Western academia over the subsequent decades.
Which brings the author's historical analysis crashing into the modern university system.
The text looks at post-1960s liberal arts sociology and gender studies departments and explicitly strips them of their academic legitimacy.
The author argues they are no longer places engaged in scholastic inquiry or the search for objective truth.
They do not operate on the scientific method.
Instead, they are categorized strictly as indoctrination mills.
Their openly stated goal in many mission statements is to produce agents of change.
The author argues that these agents are deployed into corporate HR departments, media companies, and government bureaucracies to enforce what he calls a gynocentric silence.
In the vocabulary of this worldview, a gynocentric silence is an environment where any dissent from the egalitarian feminist orthodoxy is immediately and ruthlessly suppressed.
It goes back to the James Damore example.
The university is no longer producing minds capable of Aristotle's syllogisms. It is an assembly line meticulously designed to mass produce the very NPC zombies we discussed in the first section.
So if the culture is captured and the universities are hostile, how does a man operate within the actual economy?
This necessitates a deep dive into the economics of agency, which the author frames as a stark dichotomy between the mindset of the employee and the mindset of the entrepreneur.
The author utilizes established psychological frameworks to make this point, specifically referencing Deci and Ryan's self-determination theory.
This is the psychological study of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation.
The text meticulously contrasts the modern corporate employee with the entrepreneur.
The employee operates within a rigid bureaucratic hierarchy.
His motivation is purely extrinsic. He suppresses his natural impulses, navigates HR minefields, and feigns agreement with corporate dogma purely to receive a salary and external validation.
The entrepreneur, however, is driven by intrinsic motivation.
He is taking massive, unhedged risks.
He is operating without a safety net, driven by the innate masculine desire to build a structure from nothing and impose his will upon the marketplace.
The author connects this modern dynamic directly back to ancient philosophy, citing Aristotle's fundamental distinction between economics and chematistics.
This is a vital distinction. For Aristotle, true economics referred to household management.
It was the honorable pursuit of acquiring the resources necessary for practical needs, family flourishing, and self-sufficiency.
Crematistics, on the other hand, was the unnatural accumulation of wealth, purely for the sake of hoarding wealth divorced from any tangible productive utility.
The author adapts this framework to argue that the entrepreneurial drive to conquer chaos and provide for a household is deeply natural and spiritually fulfilling.
Whereas the corporate employee mindset, trading one's sovereignty merely to accumulate numbers in a bank account while suffering bureaucratic indignities, is spiritually corrosive and biologically destructive.
Furthermore, the text claims that modern societal structures actively identify and suppress this entrepreneurial risk-taking energy from a very early age.
The author levels a devastating critique at the modern education and medical systems, arguing that when young, high-energy boys exhibit natural masculine restlessness, the very energy required to take risks and build things, they're immediately pathologized.
He argues they're slapped with diagnoses like ADHD and heavily medicated with amphetamines.
The author does not view this as medical care. He views it as chemical compliance.
He argues society is drugging young boys to force them to sit still in a feminine-coded, risk-averse classroom environment, preparing them for a lifetime of docile cubicle work.
To provide a historical countermodel to this modern corporate pacification, the author reaches deep into medieval history.
He points to the Ordenstadt, the state of the Teutonic Order centered at Marienburg.
This is a fascinating and highly specific historical pull.
He describes the Teutonic Knights not just as a religious military order, but as the ultimate idealized boys' club.
He highlights the Teutonic Order as the pinnacle of a high-trust, strictly meritocratic, and fiercely rational bureaucracy.
These were warrior monks bound by immense discipline and hierarchy.
The text emphasizes that they didn't just fight, they were master administrators.
They drained literal malarial swamps in Eastern Europe, engineered massive brick fortresses, and established complex trade routes.
They took untamed, chaotic wilderness and engineered it into an economic powerhouse.
The author holds up the Teutonic Order as undeniable proof that masculine hierarchical obedience, when combined with competence and a shared mission, generates immense surplus and builds civilization.
He then explicitly and aggressively contrasts this historical model with modern corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives.
He argues that modern progressive institutions look at a high-performance, hyper-competent, all-male unit like the Teutonic Knights with shrieking hysteria.
Not because it is evil, but because they intuitively recognize that they lack the physiological and psychological capacity to ever compete within such a rigorous framework.
This analysis of work and economic production seamlessly transitions into what is undeniably the most controversial and highly charged section of the entire text.
The application of economic theory to human relationships, which the author titles The Mathematics of Mating.
Here, the text completely strips away any cultural romanticism regarding love and soulmates, replacing it with a cold, ruthless application of rational choice theory and evolutionary biology.
Let's carefully unpack the terminology utilized here, as it is heavily reliant on established manosphere vernacular. The foundational premise of his relationship economics relies on Briffault's law.
Robert Briffaults was an early 20th century surgeon and social anthropologist.
Briffault's law, as summarized in evolutionary circles, states that the female of the species, not the male, determines all the conditions of the animal family.
It posits that where the female can derive no tangible survival or status benefit from association with the male, no such association takes place.
Past investments by the male are irrelevant, only current and future utility matter.
The author utilizes Briffault's law to argue a deeply cynical point. A man cannot negotiate genuine biological desire.
According to this framework, a man is only valued by the mating market for the physical protection he offers, the financial resources he can provide, or the social status he commands.
Once those utility metrics vanish, the relationship dissolves.
From this baseline, the text maps out the specific timeline of the modern mating market, introducing the concept of the cock carousel.
In the vocabulary of the text, this provocative term describes the decade between a woman's 18th and 28th birthdays.
Applying rational choice theory, the author argues that during these years of peak physical fertility, women act as utility-maximizing agents in an open market.
Because of the advent of dating apps, they have unprecedented access to the absolute top tier of the genetic hierarchy, the top 20% of males we discussed during the Pareto distribution segment.
In manosphere terminology, this is the alpha fucks phase.
The text argues that young women will pursue short-term, non-committal mating strategies with these high-status, physically dominant males.
The critical economic concept the author introduces here is opportunity cost.
He argues that while pursuing the top 20%, these women entirely ignore the reliable, provisioning, middle-tier men who would traditionally offer stability.
Those middle-tier men are categorized as the beta bucks.
The theory progresses to what the manosphere terms the wall, typically around age 30, when a woman's fertility and sheer physical leverage in the market begin to decline.
The text posits that at this juncture, the woman shifts her strategy, seeking out the beta bucks provider to secure financial stability and raise a family.
However, the author argues this dual mating strategy is a psychological trap that results in the alpha widow syndrome.
The logic dictates that because the woman spent her most formative hyperfertile years experiencing the absolute apex of the male genetic market, men with massive physical and social dominance, she becomes neurologically imprinted by that standard.
Therefore, when she eventually settles for the safe provisioning beta male, she is psychologically incapable of genuinely respecting him or feeling visceral biological desire for him.
And if this late-stage stabilization strategy fails entirely, the text claims the inevitable result is the cat lady syndrome, a life of permanent solitude masked by careerism.
To bolster this highly aggressive framework, the author attempts to ground it in statistical data.
He points to CDC data that shows a stark, mathematically direct correlation between the number of premarital sexual partners a woman accumulates and her statistical likelihood of initiating a divorce later in life.
The author utilizes this data to deliver a harsh warning to his male readership. The modern deregulated mating market is structurally flawed and represents a catastrophic asymmetric risk for the provisioning male.
He argues you are entering a contract where the other party has been culturally encouraged to maximize her utility at your expense,
which leads directly to the behavioral consequence of this risk assessment. The marriage strike, also known within these circles as MGTOW men going their own way.
The author does not frame this movement as an emotional retreat by bitter men who cannot find partners.
He frames it entirely through the rigorous lens of game theory, specifically utilizing the framework of the prisoner's dilemma.
Let's walk through the matrix of the prisoner's dilemma to understand his logic here.
In classic game theory, if both parties cooperate, they both achieve a reasonably good, stable outcome.
However, if one party defects while the other continues to cooperate, the defector wins massively and the cooperator is absolutely ruined.
If both defect, both get a suboptimal but survivable outcome.
The author argues that historical traditional marriage operated in the cooperation quadrant.
Cultural shame and strict legal barriers prevented defection.
However, he asserts that the modern state has completely altered the game matrix.
By instituting no-fault divorce, maintaining highly asymmetrical alimony laws, and overseeing family courts that statistically favor maternal custody, the state now heavily structurally incentivizes female defection.
The text argues that the penalty for male cooperation, if the female defects, is total annihilation. The loss of assets, the garnishing of future wages, and the alienation from his children.
Because the state has rigged the matrix to make cooperation a catastrophic risk, the author argues that acting as purely rational economic agents, high-value men are increasingly choosing the only logical move left on the board.
The defect.
They engage in a marriage strike.
They withdraw their resources, their protection, and their genetic potential from the institution of marriage entirely, because the mathematical probability of ruin vastly exceeds the potential utility of the contract.
Having meticulously deconstructed the philosophy, biology, legal apparatus, and mating market, the text finally shifts into its prescriptive phase.
Section 6 is titled The Rhetoric of Reclamation and the Cathedral Project.
The author moves from diagnosing the disease to prescribing the exact tactical and psychological responses required to survive and dominate this captured culture.
He begins with tactical advice for engaging in the dialectic, the ongoing public culture war.
He offers a fascinating, almost nostalgic retrospective on the evolution of internet discourse.
He looks back at roughly 2015, an era he dubs the debate Nebro period.
During this time, the primary weapons in online discourse were logic, statistical data, and long-form debate.
The author argues that the political right, armed with biological reality and economic data, absolutely dominated this era because the less emotional arguments simply could not survive rigorous public logical scrutiny.
The text claims that because the progressive left was being systematically routed in the arena of raw logic, they executed a brilliant, albeit cynical, tactical retreat.
They completely abandoned the framework of logic versus logic.
Instead, they shifted the entire battlefield to the framework of safety versus violence.
This is the precise historical moment when the cultural rhetoric shifted to phrases like speech is violence or silence is violence.
The author views this not as a genuine concern for safety, but as a highly effective defensive maneuver utilized by people who know they cannot win an empirical debate.
If your logic threatens their worldview, they don't have to counter your logic. They simply accuse you of causing them physical harm with your words, thereby utilizing the care-harm moral foundation to demand that the authorities censor you.
To counter this, the author instructs his readers on the aggressive, correct, Aristotelian use of rhetorical tools.
He specifically rehabilitates the concept of the ad hominem fallacy.
This is a nuanced point. He clarifies that engaging in a base ad hominem, attacking a man's physical appearance or immutable characteristics, is lazy, low-value rhetoric.
However, he argues that attacking a man's character, if his character is demonstrably relevant to the moral claims he's attempting to make, is an Aristotelian necessity.
If a man who cannot manage his own chaotic personal life attempts to dictate how society should be structured, attacking his competence is not a fallacy, it is a valid destruction of his ethos.
He also instructs his readers to relentlessly deploy Aristotle's principle of non-contradiction.
As we discussed earlier, this is the immutable law that a thing cannot be A and not A at the exact same time.
The author uses this specifically as a sledgehammer against the modern concepts of gender fluidity and subjective identity.
The text writes that the chromosomal reality of XY is not a social construct to be debated in a sociology class. It is a hardline biological mandate.
Biology does not negotiate with human feelings.
Therefore, the author advises his readers, when you are forced to debate these topics, you do not engage with their emotional state or their subjective identity.
You use the principle of non-contradiction to shatter the foundational architecture of their argument.
You attack the literal logical impossibility of their premise.
But the author acknowledges that engaging in this kind of unyielding, highly confrontational rhetorical warfare requires an incredibly stable psychological state.
You cannot be fragile if you are going to stand against the cultural tide.
He terms this required psychological state ontological security.
Ontological security is the process of building an impregnable internal mental fortress.
The author insists that a man must root his core identity and his sense of reality in things that are utterly immune to the whims of societal consensus or the screaming of the digital mob.
Your identity must be anchored in biology, physics, and classical logic.
If your psychological foundation is built on those granite blocks, then the external validation or condemnation of a captured society becomes entirely irrelevant to your functioning.
This concept is deeply tethered to the ancient Stoic reverence for the logos, the rational divine animating force that structures the universe.
The author is commanding his male readers to literally become the embodied logos.
When the storms of modern social hysteria rage, when the media narrative demands compliance, you do not drift with the emotional current.
You act as the heavy, immovable anchor.
He suggests that men must upgrade Descartes' passive observation of, I think, therefore I am into a brutally active, imposing stance. I act, therefore I create reality.
And this leads to the ultimate question of the book. What exactly are you creating with this reclaimed agency?
This brings us to the grand finale of his worldview, what he terms the cathedral building project.
To illustrate this, he creates a masterfully stark contrast with modern environmentalism.
He looks at the progressive environmental left and identifies their core mantra, leave no trace.
The author is vicious in his critique of this mindset. He labels the desire to exist without impacting the world as temporal narcissism.
He argues that the modern progressive views human existence as a blight and therefore believes the highest moral good is to shrink oneself, consume nothing, and pass through time, leaving absolutely nothing behind to indicate you were ever there.
He contrasts this leave no trace ethos with the fundamental biological masculine drive for what he calls monument building.
He uses the profound historical analogy of medieval European masons.
These were largely illiterate, rough men who spent their entire grueling lives carving massive blocks of stone to construct cathedrals.
The crucial element is that they knew with absolute certainty that they would never live long enough to see the cathedral finished.
They were building something massive for a future they would not inhabit.
He also points to the Roman legions who laid cobblestone roads 2,000 years ago that are literally still guiding European transit patterns today.
That is the essence of a transgenerational project.
The author connects this deeply masculine drive to create lasting structures back to classical theology, specifically St. Augustine's City of God.
Augustine distinguished between the earthly city, which is built on the unstable foundation of self-love and immediate gratification, and the heavenly city built on eternal principles.
The author secularizes Augustine's concept to argue that true sustaining meaning for a man does not come from passive introspective self-discovery.
He views endless therapy and internal navel-gazing as a purely feminine construct.
For a man, meaning is generated solely through active creation, directed outward toward an external purpose and dedicated to the unborn generations.
The book culminates in a powerful, commanding call to action. He tells the reader, you are ancestors in training.
Every single action you take, every stone you place, every business you aggressively build, the physical strength you forge, the family you fiercely protect and raise, contributes to a civilizational structure that will outlast your physical form.
That is how a man achieves practical immortality.
You do not achieve it by shrinking yourself to appease a hostile culture. You achieve it by imposing your competence on the world.
It is an attempt to synthesize everything we've discussed.
He is taking that raw, aggressive, status-seeking biological drive, the very energy that destroys the low-status baboon or turns the modern isolated man into a depressed incel, and he is giving it a grand, socially vital, transgenerational outlet.
He's telling men to channel that raw energy into civilizational architecture.
So if we synthesize the overarching thesis of the text, walking on water, clear ordered thinking is a highly systematized, ruthlessly biologically determinist manifesto.
It is explicitly urging men to categorically reject the cultural and emotional programming of the modern era.
It commands them to reclaim their psychological sovereignty and their physical agency.
Ultimately, it is a manual on how to walk on water.
How to stay above the chaotic emotional waves of modern society by imposing the rigid structure of clear ordered logic onto the world.
It is about seizing the wheel of the ship while the rest of the crew is paralyzed by the storm.
Which leaves us with a profound, lingering question to ponder.
As we step back from the specific cultural skirmishes and tactful advice outlined in the text, we are forced to look at the macro structure of our society.
What happens to the long-term stability of a civilization when the fundamental hardwired biological drives of half its population, the innate masculine drives for strict hierarchy, intense competition, and high-stakes risk-taking, are placed in direct structural and punitive conflict with the very institutions governing them?
It is a structural paradox.
Can a society truly survive and continue to innovate if its legal, academic, and corporate frameworks are constantly at war with the underlying biology of the men required to build and maintain its physical and economic infrastructure?
It is a question that sociologists, evolutionary biologists, and historians will be forced to grapple with for decades to come, regardless of their personal political affiliations.
That is exactly the kind of structural friction we want you to mull over and explore on your own.
We want to thank you for taking this incredibly deep, expansive dive with us today.
It has been an intense, uncompromising journey through some very heavy, highly provocative philosophical and biological terrain.
We remind you once again to like and subscribe to the show. Your engagement is what allows us to keep dedicating this level of granular analysis to these complex topics.
Please direct yourself to Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to purchase the ebook we rigorously unpacked today, Walking on Water, Clear, Ordered Thinking.
And finally, to explore these concepts further, to see the exact data he cites, and to observe how the author applies this classical rhetorical framework in real time to modern events, we explicitly encourage you to go and follow the author at Conrad Dreicher on Substack.
You can also find his daily commentary at Conrad Reicher on Twitter, and check out his long-form video essays at Conrad Reicher on YouTube.
Thank you for listening. And until next time, keep thinking clearly.